There is a question that many are still asking, a subject that many are still discussing, a topic that many are still invested in. Will there be a fresh election in Zimbabwe? Will SADC force ED to organize a fresh election in Zimbabwe? Can SADC force ED to organize fresh elections? What happened to the SADC Observer Mission report, and for goodness sake, why is Zimbabwe going to host a SADC summit in August of this year? Is SADC planning anything at all regarding the Zimbabwean political crisis? Well, fellow Sadza eaters, slay queens and bingers, socialites, papalites, vasnama lights, varikudya rice, nevasnama rights. Welcome to the special report. Now, before we begin, I want to start by apologizing for not giving you guys special reports frequently. But that's only because I'm not a full-time content creator. I do this part-time. Plus, I do all of this by myself. The entire production, research, filming, lighting, video editing, sound, everything. I do it by myself. It's time consuming and it's literally impossible for me to give you special reports daily. But if you guys partner with me, if you donate, I'll be able to hire people that will help me in preparing these special reports. That way, you can start having your favorite special report program more frequently. Now, let's get back to the business of the day. Before we start, or rather attempt answering the question of will SADC force ED to organize a fresh election, we first of all need to understand how SADC functions and why it was formed. Understanding this will give us a better appreciation of what SADC can and can't do, does and doesn't do, will and won't do. The Southern African Development Community, commonly known as SADC, is a community of 16 countries, namely Zimbabwe, South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, Botswana, Namibia, Mozambique, Tanzania, Angola, DRC, Lesotho, Eswatini, Mauritius, Seychelles, Comoros, and Madagascar. These are the countries that make up the community of SADC, the Southern African Development Community. This community was established in 1992, which coincidentally is the same year the English Premier League in its modern state was established. But of course, we are not talking about football today. Let's get back to politics. Remember, we are trying to understand how SADC functions and why it was formed, because understanding this will draw us closer to the answer we are seeking in today's topic. So, the grandmother of SADC was a regional grouping called the Frontline States, which was created in the 70s to fight apartheid and white minority rule in Southern Africa. But the problem was that all the independent states in Southern Africa at the time were heavily dependent on apartheid South Africa. So there was need for economic liberation. In fact, from as early as 1979, South Africa itself was actually trying to establish its own regional grouping called the Constellation of Southern African States, which it hoped would include Zimbabwe Rhodesia, led by Muzorewa, Namibia, which was actually under the administration of South Africa, and possibly Malawi, which was not a member of the Frontline States. So, as a way of countering this and most importantly, reducing their dependence on apartheid South Africa, the Frontline States decided to establish the Southern African Development Coordination Conference in April 1980, 17 days before the independence of Zimbabwe. When Zimbabwe got independent, it became a member of this new grouping. The addition of Zimbabwe added some weight on this new regional grouping because Zimbabwe had the second strongest economy in the region at the time, second only to South Africa. Unlike the United Nations, the Southern African Development Coordination Conference was not established by a charter or a treaty. It was established via a memorandum of understanding. So that means it wasn't a legal person. In other words, you couldn't sue it and it couldn't sue you in its own personal capacity. In 1989, which is also the year I was born, regional leaders gathered in Harare, Zimbabwe, and in that summit, they decided to formalize the Southern African Development Coordination Conference. Remember, it wasn't a legal person. It was established by a memorandum of understanding. So they decided to give it an appropriate legal status. This is what led to the formulation of a treaty. This treaty was adopted, signed and effected on the 17th of August 1992 in Windhoek, Namibia. This is the treaty which established SADC. So there you have it. SADC was formed, or rather established, on the 17th of August 1992. The headquarters of SADC are in Botswana. This treaty, which I'm talking about, is the constitution of SADC. All member states are bound by it and to it. It establishes the institutions of SADC and how they operate. In theory, member states are supposed to create laws that are in line with the SADC treaty, but as you will see later, this is not always the case, particularly in countries that preach the gospel of sovereignty more than others. And just like the United Nations, SADC was established on the principle of the sovereign equality of all its member states, the principle of solidarity, peace and security, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. The SADC Treaty lays out the institutions that perform the functions of SADC. So now, let's talk about the institutions of SADC. And keep in mind, these institutions were established by the SADC Treaty. These institutions perform the functions of SADC. When we say SADC has done this, SADC has gone there, SADC has intervened, it's the SADC institutions. Keep in mind, in doing all of this, we are trying to understand how SADC functions and why it was formed. Because understanding this will bring us closer to the answer that we are seeking in today's topic. Institution number 1, the Summit of Heads of State and Government. This is similar to the United Nations General Assembly. This is a forum where all the heads of state and government from all over SADC meet to discuss the social, political, and economic issues of Southern Africa. This is the highest decision-making and policy-making body of SADC. Institution number 2, the Organ on Politics, Defense and Security. This is more like the United Nations Security Council. It's responsible for the maintenance of peace and security in the region. The Organ on Politics, Defense and Security is sometimes simply referred to as the organ. Its chairman is President Hakainde Hichilema of Zambia. Institution number 3, the Council of Ministers. This institution is responsible for the implementation and supervision of the policies and programs of the summit. It's made up of all the foreign ministers from all the SADC member states. Institution number 4, the Secretariat. Just like the United Nations, SADC has a secretariat which is responsible for all the administrative work. Institution number 5, the SADC Tribunal. Just like the United Nations, SADC has a court of appeal called the SADC Tribunal, whose function is to ensure adherence and the proper interpretation of the provisions of the SADC Treaty. Now, there are other institutions like your Troika, cluster meetings and stuff like that, but I won't go into that because of time. I should also mention that SADC has an executive secretary who performs a role similar to the United Nations Secretary General. The current executive secretary of SADC is Elias Mahosi from Botswana. But now that we have a clear understanding of the institutions of SADC, we now want to find out what SADC can and can't do regarding the internal political affairs of its member states. Let's go to Article 2 of the SADC Protocol on Politics, Defense and Security. It says here, the specific objectives of the organ shall be, and oh, by the way, I'm hoping that we are still on the same page. Remember that organ which I said is currently chaired by President Hakainde Hichilema? That organ which I said is similar to the United Nations Security Council? Well, that is the organ whose protocol I am reading here. It says, the objectives of the organ are to A. Protect the people and safeguard the development of the region against instability arising from the breakdown of law and order, intrastate and interstate conflict and aggression. B. Promote political cooperation among state parties and the evolution of common political values and institutions. C. Develop common foreign policy approaches on issues of mutual concern and advance such policy collectively in international fora. D. Promote regional cooperation and coordination on matters related to security and defense and establish appropriate mechanisms to this end. E. Prevent, contain, and resolve inter- and intra-state conflict by peaceful means. F. Consider enforcement action in accordance with international law as a matter of last resort where peaceful means have failed. G. Promote the development of democratic institutions and practices within the territories of state parties and encourage the observance of universal human rights as provided for in the charters and conventions of the Organization of African Unity and the United Nations, respectively. Okay, so now that we understand the objectives of the organ on politics, defense and security, we now want to find out, when does SADC actually intervene in the internal affairs of its member states? What are some of the things that can warrant a SADC intervention? Well, Article 12 of the SADC Protocol on Politics, Defense and Security says that SADC can intervene in defense of a member state that is under attack from a foreign force. SADC can also intervene in a dispute over territorial boundaries. So that means if, God forbid, Zambia and Zimbabwe get into an actual war over ownership of Victoria Falls, SADC can actually intervene to deal with that. SADC also intervenes when there is large-scale violence between sections of the population or between the state and sections of the population, including genocide, ethnic cleansing, and gross violation of human rights. So that's why SADC didn't intervene when soldiers gunned down unarmed civilians in the CBD in 2018. I'm talking about the Harare CBD shootings in 2018. Because you see, SADC only intervenes when the violence is large scale. Of course, the question then comes, at what point does this violence become large scale? How do you quantify and qualify it? Because even the 2008 violence against MDC supporters was not enough to immediately trigger a SADC intervention. Another issue that can cause SADC to intervene is a condition of a civil war or insurgency and any conflict which threatens peace and security in the region. SADC can also intervene when there is a military coup or a definite threat to the legitimate authority of a state. This is why the 2017 coup in Zimbabwe was planned to perfection. So, what did General Chiwenga do to insulate his military operation? Well, General Chiwenga maintained that his military operation was not a coup. It was not a coup, the first one of its kind on planet Earth. He said that the president was safe, quote unquote, we are only targeting criminals around the president. General Chiwenga maintained that Robert Mugabe remained the commander-in-chief when in reality he no longer was, because the army deployed itself. Chiwenga even allowed Robert Mugabe to go about his business as usual, officiating a university graduation ceremony, much to the utter disgust of many Zimbabweans who were desperate to see him stepping down. But Chiwenga knew what he was doing. He was insulating his coup. Chiwenga's masterstroke was getting Robert Mugabe to do a press conference and announce to the world that the military intervention did not amount to a coup d'etat. That was a diplomatic masterstroke by General Chiwenga. Just by that event alone, he buried Robert Mugabe and even legitimized the whole process by inviting citizens to march in solidarity with his action. Well done, General Chiwenga. How to do a not a coup, Volume 1. I mean, he even got Parliament involved, seduced the opposition, hoodwinked the whole country into believing that the departure of Robert Mugabe was going to be the end of their problems. And as Robert Mugabe put his signature on that resignation letter, SADC had no choice but to believe that indeed it was a not a coup. How to insulate a coup, written by you-know-who. That is how General Chiwenga avoided a SADC intervention. Okay, so let's say SADC has finally decided to intervene in a country, in a member state. How does it actually intervene? What methods does it use in its intervention? Well, it says here, the methods employed by the organ on politics, defense and security to prevent, manage and resolve conflict by peaceful means shall include preventive diplomacy, which is basically steps taken to ensure that the problem does not escalate, negotiations, conciliation, mediation, good offices, which basically means we will help you figure out your issues, but we won't tell you what to do. It also goes on to say arbitration and adjudication by an international tribunal. It goes on to say that the organ shall establish an early warning system in order to facilitate timeous action to prevent the outbreak and escalation of conflict. It's very clear. SADC's first port of call is always a peaceful resolution. But if a peaceful resolution is not possible, then the chairperson of the organ, President Hakainde Hichilema, will write to the Summit of Heads of State and Government recommending a military intervention. It's exactly what happened in 1998 when there were issues in the DRC. At the time, Robert Mugabe was the chairperson of the organ and Nelson Mandela was the chairperson of SADC. It was Robert Mugabe in his capacity as the chair of the organ who recommended that a military intervention be taken in the DRC. And of course, the summit is the one that then authorizes that intervention. But the most important thing to note is that the summit will only authorize a military intervention only as a matter of last resort. Remember, peaceful resolution is the gospel of SADC. And furthermore, SADC takes military action only with the authorization of the United Nations Security Council. So you can tell that the scope of the SADC intervention in member states is almost limited to cases of military aggression, secession, genocide, and extreme cases of gross violations of human rights at a grand scale. Remember that the SADC Treaty was adopted, signed and effected on the basis of the sovereign equality of all member states, the principle of territorial integrity, political independence, good neighborliness, interdependence, non-aggression, and non-interference in the internal affairs of member states. But you will find that the biggest problem is actually not SADC's limitations in what it can do to manage conflicts. The biggest problem is actually political willingness. Many countries in SADC have actually violated the provisions of the SADC Treaty without any consequences befalling them. Countries like Zimbabwe will always hide behind the principle of sovereign equality and territorial integrity of member states. In 2008, white commercial farmers took the Zimbabwean government to the SADC tribunal. They won the case. But guess what? Robert Mugabe rubbished the ruling. He called it nonsensical and of no consequence. He said SADC does not have a jurisdiction over Zimbabwean land disputes. That right there, ladies and gentlemen, was a classic example of how state sovereignty will almost always prevail over SADC statutes, regulations, and resolutions. That makes SADC inherently weak in dealing with rogue states. Even in the 2008 runoff election, the long-sleeve, short-sleeve barbaric choppings which happened in the ZANU-PF political bases, which I sometimes like to call the Zimbabwean version of Hitler's concentration camps, those barbaric choppings did not immediately trigger a SADC intervention. In fact, Thabo Mbeki came shortly afterwards, and guess what he said? Quote unquote, "There is no crisis in Zimbabwe." It took the complete collapse of the Zimbabwean economy, which rendered Zimbabweans the poorest trillionaires, for SADC to finally intervene. So now, you tell me, do you think that the current Zimbabwean political crisis can trigger a SADC intervention? Compare and contrast the 2008 election with the 2023 election. Look at the factors that triggered a SADC intervention in 2008. Do those factors exist today? After the 2008 runoff, SADC didn't congratulate Mugabe for winning a one-man race. The AU didn't congratulate Mugabe. The UN also didn't congratulate Mugabe. But in the just-ended election, SADC, AU, and the UN congratulated Mnangagwa. Furthermore, SADC simply noted the Observer Mission report and didn't act on it. In fact, last year, Zimbabwe was elected deputy chair of SADC just before the harmonized elections. As we speak, Zimbabwe is still the deputy chair of SADC. The SIOM report didn't trigger a demotion. Zimbabwe is still the vice chair of SADC. The current chairperson of SADC is President Lourenço of Angola. He took over last year from President Tshisekedi of DRC. Lourenço was Tshisekedi's deputy. So the way it works is that whoever is the vice chairperson becomes the incoming chairperson. Actually, let's go to the official site of SADC just so you guys can have a true appreciation of what I'm talking about. As you can see, the incoming chairperson of SADC is Emmerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa. There it is, straight from the official website of SADC. Zimbabwe is the next chair of SADC, and that makes Mnangagwa the next chairperson of SADC. So now, you tell me, does that look like a SADC that is ready to deal with the Zimbabwean political crisis? Doesn't that look like a SADC that has moved on and accepted that it is what it is? The truth of the matter is that our solution is at home. We are our own liberators. SADC is not going to come and fix our problems. We have to do it ourselves. Political apathy must fall. I mean, we can't continue to be apathetic and expect SADC to be sympathetic. I mean, we seem pathetic. We don't behave like a country that has a political crisis. It's as if everything is fine. Busy hero-worshipping bingas, bootlicking Chivayo for cars. Speaking of Chivayo, is Wycliffe Chivayo now the de facto Vice President of the Republic of Zimbabwe? Well, that sounds like a subject for another special report. And as always, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy the content, do like and share.